He's written 5 books, from Common Sense in 1995 to Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie last year. He also hosts a weekly podcast, The Takeout, covering politics, public policy, and pop culture. It's broadcast on CBS Radio, Sirius, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. His latest podcast is an ambitious 8-episode series, a 2-year investigation of Robert Hanssen, the notorious spy next door, a double agent who lived quietly in suburban Virginia, working simultaneously for the FBI and the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In this time, Mr. Garrett has had a front row seat to history. From his childhood in San Diego, he's been fascinated by news and politics. He's traveled the world, reported on 7 different speakers of the House of Representatives, I learned today soon to be 8, and is now covering his 9th presidential campaign. Mr. Garrett received bachelor degrees in journalism and political science from the University of Missouri. He's married to Laura Brown, a professor of political science and until last year, director of George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management in Washington, D.C. They have 3 children. Colleagues and bosses agree. Major Garrett is a rare combination of a hard worker, a very smart, very competitive journalist who is also an awfully nice guy. Throughout the day today, he shared that combination with students in classes, over coffee, and at lunch. Tonight, happy to say, he is with us, ready to share his report from the nation's capital. His address is entitled 2024, an election like no other. We want to thank our sponsors, Leonard's Photography and Casa Monica Hotel, and thank you, of course, for being with us tonight. Know that you will welcome your questions at the end of the presentation, and you'll have a chance to engage with our speaker. So again, Major Garrett, welcome, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Art, very much. As you'll notice, no prepared remarks. I'm not going to drone on here. You don't need to listen to me for 45 minutes. You were handed around places to write down questions. I urge you to do that. My intent tonight is to engage with you as directly as possible, get your questions, answer them as best I can, but I do have remarks I want to give you. I just want to let you know that the question and answer part is going to be an interactive and heavy part of tonight's program. As Art noted, my first presidential campaign was 1992. I've covered every presidential campaign since then, and the American presidency and Congress ever since. Started that work in 1990. So I've seen a lot transpire in American politics, and when I picked the title for this talk, I picked it about 2.5, 3 months ago. And I thought it would be a kind of title that would stand the test of time. And I'm more convinced that it stands the test of time even than I was 3 months ago. An election like no other, because you have all heard this phrase. I've heard this phrase. The next election for the presidency of the United States is the most important election of our lives. You're all nodding. You've all heard this. I'm not going to tell you it's the most important election of your lives. You may believe that, you may not believe it. I'm not going to tell you that. You'll decide that for yourself. What I can tell you with absolute certainty, as not only a student of the politics in the times that I've lived them and covered them, but as a student of American history, which I do in my spare time, where we are heading, we have never been before. These are not just uncharted waters, they are unchartable waters. We don't know what the terrain is in front of us, whether it's land or sea. We don't know. And what do I mean by that? We've never had a president as old as President Biden seek re-election. We have no idea how his health, which appears solid today, it's criticized by some, but appears medically sound and solid now, will be 6 months from now. And I don't say that as a criticism of the president at all. That's not a partisan statement. It's a statement of lived experience. I cared for my mother the last 2 years of her life, from 81 to 83. My mother died of vascular brain disease. And I can tell you from my lived experience, and it's not the only arbiter of my thought process here, but it's a not insignificant one, I know the difference that 6 months can make, cognitively. I know you can be one place, 1 month, and 6 months later be in a fundamentally different place through no fault of your own. Not because people aren't paying attention, not because people aren't trying to help you, not because you're not trying, but you can be in a different place. That's just a fact. It's a fact that I lived. It's a fact of medical science. So when I say we don't know where the president's going to be, I mean that. And I don't mean that to criticize. I just mean it's a fact. And we don't know. That is a great unknown. I think that's why the polling data about the desire for the president to seek re-election continues to show not only anxiety, but borderline hostility to the idea. Because we don't want as a country to go through that. But that's where we are. So that's uncharted territory. We've never had the leading candidate for a political party in this country be subject to as many civil and criminal proceedings as former President Trump is beginning to start right now. There's a civil trial going on in New York right now. A gag order was just issued today by the judge in that case. That's the first of 7. You may think there's 4 criminal, but there are 3 civil. We don't know as a country how we're going to absorb all that, how the former president is going to absorb that, how he's going to act and react and sound about all of that, how we're going to believe either that this process is working and is just or is not working and unjust. And that decision will bleed heavily over and influence heavily political calculations that people will make in advance of primaries and caucuses that start in January in Iowa. That is completely uncharted terrain. We just don't know what that looks like. We don't know how we're going to absorb that. We don't know how we're going to respond to that. I've covered police news in 3 different cities in America before I got to Washington: Amarillo, Texas, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Houston, Texas. I didn't cover a lot of criminal trials, but I covered more than a few. And one thing I can tell you is I encountered more than one boastful, aggressive defendant outside the courthouse on day 1. But it's been my observed experience that defendants sometimes get smaller in the courtroom, that their boisterousness on the outside doesn't work in the 4 corners of a courtroom where the only questions are law, evidence, and process. And their sense of self constricts a little bit. And they get a little smaller because the world around them starts to tighten up in that process. I don't know if that's going to happen to former President Trump, but it might. I don't know how the country's going to respond to that. I don't know how his supporters will respond to that. It might be negative, it might be positive. All I'm saying to you is it's an unknown. It is an unknown. We also don't know whether or not this No Labels group, which has already about $60 to $80 million behind it, can and will produce an alternative if the 2 parties nominate Biden and Trump. And we don't know what the effect of that will be. I've talked to Larry Hogan, former Republican governor of Maryland, numerous times, and Joe Manchin, senator of West Virginia, the 2 people mentioned most likely to be the dream Republican Democratic ticket. I should just let you know, a little secret, they haven't decided, and I don't think they're going to very easily decide who's the presidential and who's the vice presidential. Both have told me on no uncertain terms that neither of them are going to be the vice presidential nominee. So that's a bit of a sticky wicket. We don't know how that's going to sort out. And I've asked both of them a kind of fundamental question. I'm like, okay, whatever the embedded flaws of the 2-party system might be, right now the Republicans and the Democrats have a means by which they produce a nominee. Primaries, caucuses, it's a transparent process. Everyone knows the rules, knows the dates, knows the locations. The delegates are assembled, the delegates are added up, and we have enough delegates, you become the nominee. Whatever you think of that process, at least it's a process, and it's wide open. Lots of people can participate. You can see it. I said, how are you guys going to produce this ticket? Are you just going to go to dinner? You're just going to go to a really nice restaurant and just keep the wine working around the table and have as many appetizers as you need, have a really good entree, and then at dessert, say, okay, this is what it's going to be. Then walk out and tell the country, here we go. Isn't this amazing? We had this great dinner, and here are the nominees. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but how does the country respond to that? We also have a former president seeking to return to the White House. That's happened only once in our history. Grover Cleveland did that. Grover Cleveland ran and won in 1884, ran and lost in 1888, ran and won in 1892. Quick history lesson. Women weren't allowed to vote then, and certainly African Americans were not allowed to vote then. So there's a much smaller population to choose from. So there's no real extrapolation we can do from that. By the way, in the first two elections I mentioned, 1884 and 1888, Washington wasn't even a state. It was a territory. Neither was Oklahoma. Neither was New Mexico. The country was very different at that time. So I don't think that's something we can go back to and say, well, what lessons can we learn from Grover Cleveland's approach to the White House the second time? It's not applicable at all. So we know that there is a set of mathematical calculations before us that tell us everything that we see before our eyes is settled and set. What do I mean by that? Well, former President Trump has the largest lead ever assembled by the front runner seeking a party's nomination. No one as positioned as former President Trump is now and was the entire summer has ever lost a nomination. He's that far ahead. So, all of our statistical evidence, all of our lived history, everything I can flip through in any book I can find will tell me, well, he's going to be the nominee. Okay, set that aside for just a second. President Biden has no internal party challengers. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has already said he's going to run as a third party. Marianne Williamson is not a serious Democratic challenger to the president. He's rearranged the party calendar, so South Carolina is first. South Carolina is where he won his first primary, catapulted him to the nomination. Though there is considerable nervousness about the prospect of the president seeking re-election, no one is challenging him. So he is as solidly set up for renomination as could possibly be. That also, therefore, is set. Nothing available to us tells us anything can be different. But I told you all those things before that could be different, that we've never seen before, that we've never felt before, that we've never experienced before. And so we don't have any behavioral, historical, or statistical models to guide us through where we're about to go. I said this morning in the class that I was privileged enough to speak at. In my career, I've never seen a campaign in front of me that, for all the reasons I just said, looks more settled, but feels to me intuitively and in my gut more fluid. I see some nods in the audience. Maybe it feels the same way to you. I guarantee you, I'm not here as a know-it-all. I don't do predictions. I never have. I am an observer. I'm a witness. I'm a reporter. I've always done nothing more and nothing less than that. Trust me, that's enough of a job. It's particularly enough of a job right now in a stage of American history and American politics. One last thing I will say before I open it up for questions, and it's kind of a meta observation. I was reading the history of Flagler College. I was reading the history of Henry Flagler. And it took me back to some things I'd read about the Gilded Age. And let me make a suggestion to you about the comparisons between the Gilded Age and the digital age in which we live now. The Gilded Age was a time of rapid, jarring, displacing technological innovation. Understood norms of economics, social cohesion, culture were radically transformed. Agrarian life was disrupted. City life became an engine not only of growth, but of squalor, poverty, crime, and also tremendous concentrated wealth. Does any of that sound familiar to you? It was also a very convulsive time in our politics. There were sizable switches in partisan orientation in Congress, 60, 70 seat switches. Why? Because voters were hungry for someone to give them answers about this time that made them feel so unmoored. We're electrifying the country. Railroads are crossing the country. Everything, space and time, are shrinking before our very eyes. Our way of making a living is vanishing before our very eyes. Somebody better have an answer. And the political parties groped in the dark for an answer. And angry voters voted them in and voted them out. of that sound familiar? That concentration of wealth led to deep-seated questions about this entire experiment in our country. What was the definition of Americanism? What was the definition of a equitable set of relationships between management, which was now beginning to control these industries, and the labor force that needed to feed them? There was tremendous strife over this very question. People died on behalf of basic labor rights in this maw of machinery that was the Industrial Revolution. There were casualties, and there were political compromises, and there were clashes. We don't have anything on that scale yet, but I would suggest that the labor unrest this year is reflective of some of those tensions, just in a different context. The eras are not exactly the same, but they are more alike than they are unalike. In times of transformation like this, and I don't know about you, but I don't need artificial intelligence to tell me that this already disruptive, completely cataclysmic technological time is about to go to the 10th power, which is what everyone tells me. I've had enough. I tell my friends all the time, the more digital the world becomes, the more analog I become. I like paper books that I write in myself. I use my phone, but I use it sparingly. I am not a digital enthusiast, if you will. I've adapted, I've made accommodations in my career, of course, to all these technological requirements, but I'm not comfortable with them, and I don't need the prospect of machine learning to further revolutionize this. I am, even though in any practical sense, one of the winners of this era. I have a very good job, I'm well compensated, I'm somewhat well known. I'm a winner if they're gonna classify, we're gonna categorize who are the winners in the media world. I'm still here. I haven't been washed away in the massive contraction that my industry has gone through, both in newspapering, magazines, and television. I've adapted, I've survived, I'm a winner. But I still feel tremendously disrupted. I feel unmoored. If I feel that way, I know 90% of the country at some level feels the same way. And that's reflected in our politics. Our politics feel anxious. People tell me this all the time. I'm anxious, I'm exhausted, I'm wrung out by it because people are either anxious, fearful, resentful, feel powerless, or uncertain. Those are all legitimate human feelings in this time of transformation, just as they were during the Gilded Age. They were reflected in politics then. We should be not surprised that they're reflected in our politics now. Politics is an essentially human enterprise. And I'm not one of those reporters who criticizes politics for being too angry or too whatever. It is what it is. Political actors do as they do because they are getting signals from people who elect them. Pure and simple. It's a linear truth. It's a through line. And tense and anxious times create tense and anxious politics. The most recent, and I'll just check my watch, something may have happened in the last half hour. But the most recent example of that is we now don't have a Speaker of the House. Now, many of you might say, oh, so what? Come on, it's just a figurehead. Okay, at a certain level, that's true. You'll wake up in your house the exact same way tomorrow and the next day and the next day, whether or not there's a speaker or a speaker pro tem. And pro tem is a Latin word that basically means for the time being. So we can have a speaker for the time being or a legit speaker. And your days and weeks will not materially change, not immediately. But if you're invested at any level, intellectually or emotionally or spiritually, because I think American experiment is a spiritual experiment as well. Experience, not experiment, but it's experience. I feel it. So intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, you might care about the continuance of the first legislative branch of government written down in the Constitution. The House was first for a reason. Framers of this country built the House in a very specific way, gave it very important constitutional powers that the Senate does not possess. The Senate considers itself, this may or may not be true, but it certainly considers itself the world's greatest deliberative body, but it can't raise a tax and it can't spend any money, not unless the House does first. Senate can't pass a tax, can't raise it, can't cut it, can't appropriate a single dollar for anything. National defense, healthcare, education, nothing, unless the House goes first. The House is a significantly important institutional body in the legislative branch. It is given, invested with the constitutional power to appropriate money and to assess taxation. Well, when there's no speaker, there's no functional majority to run that institution. And when there's no functional majority to run that institution, it's just 435 semi-well-dressed, pretty well-educated people milling around. That's what it is. And again, that's not going to change your life tomorrow. It's not going to change your life next Wednesday. But it does change America's trajectory. And don't kid yourself. People who wish this country ill pay attention to things like that. Our enemies notice. They see it as weakness. They see it as chaos. They see it as an inability to do basic things. And when America can't do basic things, bad things happen. I'm not predicting anything. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know it's not good. I know it's always better when America takes care of its business first and then projects that ability to take care of its business to the rest of the world. I've traveled the world. I've seen the effect the arrival of Air Force One has. I've seen the excitement. I've seen the sense of admiration. I've seen the sense of wonder in people's eyes. How do you people do it? How do you keep your stuff together? How do you project both internal and external strength? How do you set such a good example? Not a perfect example, no one does, but how do you set such a good example? I've heard those questions all over the world. Makes me proud to be an American, makes me proud to be a journalist covering the presidency, always has. I'm quite sure it always will. So when we don't take care of business, we send a different signal. And the signal we're sending today is another example of our inability to, A, work together. And this isn't even an observation about working together across party lines. It's an observation about working together within the same party. And when the same party can't work together on behalf of the thing that it's organized to do, be a majority to run the House of Representatives, then something fundamentally is pulling apart. I don't know who the next speaker is going to be. I only know that next speaker is going to be temporary. Because this one was. And things like that are not forgotten in politics. Muscle memory matters. It matters in athletics. It matters with your golf swing. Anyone here a golfer? Right? It matters with your golf swing, your muscle memory. What do you do? What do you do repetitively? Muscle memory matters. We now have muscle memory we've never had before. Never in the history of this country until today did the majority party oust its own speaker for nothing. Did he murder someone? Did he commit a crime? Did he take a Mountain Dew out of a convenience store? No. He kept the government open. That was Kevin McCarthy's crime. He kept the government open. After giving his side week upon week upon week to make sure the government would stay open on its terms, when it couldn't do it, he said, I have to keep the government open so I'll get votes over here. So his crime, for which he lost the speakership for the first time in our nation's history, the crime was keeping the government open. That's not going to change your life tomorrow or next Wednesday, but believe me when I tell you it's not good. It's not healthy. It's not good for the system and the way the system perpetuates itself. Our system perpetuates itself. This will be my last observation before I throw things open for a question. Our system perpetuates itself not because there is some magic potion, not because there is always a set of perfectly ethical, perfectly visionary, perfectly competent leaders. Our system perpetuates itself because we cannot abide the alternative. The Constitution tells us what the roadmap is. And for all of our history since the ratification of that document in 1789, We have not abided the alternative. We are getting closer to that. That is a worrying sign from my vantage point. And that's another variable in the uncharted terrain that lays before us between now and November of 2024. And on that incredibly optimistic note, again, let me thank you for being here. I'm honored by your presence. It's great to be here. I've gotten to know St. Augustine. It's my first trip here to St. Augustine. I've obviously been in and out of Florida many times. I cover politics after all, but have never been to this beautiful place in Florida. It's been a delight to be here. I'm honored by your presence, and let's have a conversation.
Come on up. I'm Jim Tedman. I direct the forum, and I regard this as a major success to have had Major Garrett here today. He's just been a wonderful, wonderful speaker. What we'll do with the questions is while you're writing your questions, and we'll collect them in the next few minutes. But we have faculty member Lucia Vitti from the Communications Department, and two students, Audrey Chapman and Oakley Trail. Okay, good. I'm sorry. Oakley Trail with us to ask questions. Why don't you go first, Professor, and then we'll have. Why don't you? You can stay right here. Yes, I think. And when the students are introduced, or introduce yourselves, tell us where you're from. Tell us what you're majoring in. Okay.
Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Lucia Vitti. I am an adjunct professor. I teach the art of podcasting. Yeah, how about that? It's fun. All right, I'm going to ask a question that I actually threw out to my class. I had them as an extra credit assignment. Write any question after researching Major Garrett. And Randy Giglio asked a very lovely question. Very interesting question. I had the pleasure of interviewing Major Garrett this afternoon for Flagler College Radio. So Randy asks, as someone who has covered politics extensively, what do you believe are the most pressing issues facing the USA today, and how can journalists effectively cover them?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, and one of the things that is important about journalism is to not get too far ahead of a question like that. What do I mean? What I mean is it is helpful but also dangerous for a newsroom of senior editorial supervisors to sit around a desk, maybe 5 or 6 of them, and decide the issues of the day. Okay? There's a certain arrogance that comes with that. And it's something we have to check ourselves about. We have to pay attention to the signals that voters are sending us through various means, polling, interviews, and the like, to find out what's on their mind. It was mentioned by Art that I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri. And our School of Journalism recently did a project to find out if they could answer one of these questions. What's most on the mind of voters, but in different places? So they went to Brooklyn, New York, and they went to a place called Moberly, Missouri, which is about 40 miles outside of Columbia, Missouri, rural town, dead center of the country geographically, and pretty much dead center of northern Missouri. The two places could not be more different, Moberly, Missouri, and Brooklyn, New York. Something interesting was discovered when they went through a roster of questions for people living in both communities. There was one issue they both rated the highest: housing. Housing. Not foreign policy, not technology, not healthcare, not education, housing. Two wildly different communities in terms of population, in terms of urbanization, in terms of racial makeup, could not be more different. And yet they had the exact same top issue, and it wasn't close. Housing. The availability and cost thereof. That's like a signal. Pay attention. Are we covering this enough? Things like that are ways in which we have to try to reach readers, reach consumers of information, and reach those who they talk back to, meaning politicians. We try to do this in Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Why? Because in those states, in the early caucus and primary states, those are the states where you can actually see a good number of voters, have interactions with them on a casual basis at an event like this. A politician will come to something like this. We'll talk to them before, we'll talk to them afterwards. After South Carolina, that part of the campaign ends. It's just over. Why? Because the calendar is too fast, the places are too numerous, and it all goes back to airport rallies and short stops, and you're zooming all over everywhere. And that opportunity to interact with voters for any length of time disappears. So I'm always heartbroken when South Carolina primary is over, because I know the super fun part of covering politics, talking to voters, is basically finished, or it's much more short-circuited than it is normally. So we have an obligation not to propound and not to say these are the grand issues of the day. We have to be curious about them. We have to look through polling data and sift and see where consistencies are. But if you tried that, you wouldn't have found this housing thing that was discovered by researchers at my university in Moberly, Missouri, and Brooklyn, New York. So I think we need to reach out as much as we possibly can, listen to what people say, and ask questions based on the things that they identify, not that you identify on their behalf as issues they care about most. Now, there will be times when the Washington-based media will not and cannot do that. Here's a classic example. Impeachment, whether it's Biden or Trump. Lots of the country didn't care about that either way. Certainly the first one, lots of Republicans didn't care about it. A lot of Democrats did, but nobody, but that was sort of like, even when Republicans or Democrats went to their town halls, they didn't get a lot of questions about impeachment. Washington reporters were incessantly writing and talking and conversing about impeachment as if there was nothing else going on, because it was a classic clash, conflict Washington story. There are times when our industry, and specifically Washington-based reporters, will be nauseatingly predictable in that sense. We will just pound this story over and over and over, and I can hear across the great remainder of the country, can't you do anything else? Can't you possibly do anything else? Sometimes we get into those ruts, and we have to knock ourselves out of them as frequently as we can, which is harder than it sounds. Because you know, in a competitive environment, your competitors are doing this, and you don't want to lose that competitive edge. So it's harder than it sounds, but we have these conversations all the time, and I certainly advocate for ways to do that when possible.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Oakley Terrell. I'm from Ormond Beach, Florida, and I'm double majoring in criminology and sociology.
Excellent.
My question for you is, what is the biggest change that you have observed over all the presidential elections you have covered?
So the easiest answer is technology. In the ways that presidents communicate and the way voters absorb. And the way journalists are communicated to and the way we communicate back. In 1992, and I think all of you in this room will understand what I'm talking about, the radical, transformative, technological innovation of Bill Clinton's presidential campaign was the blast fax. See, you don't know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about, because you all know what a fax, you can remember what a fax machine was. There was a time in your life when you thought it was incredibly cool. Just like I did. What a blast fax was for these two wonderful people. The fax machine was something in which you could put a piece of paper, dial a telephone number, and after quite a bit of noises and beeps and annoying growls and groans, that piece of paper would feed in and it would magically appear somewhere quite distant from that as a copy. And the Clinton campaign would always respond to George Herbert Walker Bush, the sitting president's speeches or pronouncements, with a blast fax that with one push of the fax machine in Little Rock, Arkansas, would send their response to 100 newsrooms all at the same time. It was unbelievable. It was radical. It was insanely fast. They got everyone in one fell swoop. Before, what did you have to do? You had to call every individual reporter. That's what happened. You called an individual reporter one at a time. Suddenly, I got all 100. I've only worked for 4 minutes. How did I do this? That was the great leap of 1992. Okay? If any of you remember when then nominee Barack Obama was communicating to the nation who his running mate was going to be, he did that via text. Remember that? Yeah. The text mechanism was meant to go around all the reporters. I know because I was insanely competitive against Chuck Todd and a bunch of others trying to confirm who the running mate was going to be. It was down to 2 people. 2 people. And Chuck Todd beat me to Joe Biden by about 5 minutes. Son of a gun. But they communicated it. They didn't confirm it. They didn't issue a press release. There wasn't a statement. There was a text. Why? Well, that was a campaign building endeavor. Sign up for the text so you'll be the first to know. That was a way to build their list of identifiable, most likely voters. So that was a tool of communication that set the media aside. The media was going to cover that anyway. What they wanted was this sense of relationship between those who were following the campaign and most eagerly supporting it. They wanted the text information. So that was a big event. That was another technological advancement that changed the way, because before it would have been a press conference and a walkout and a set of speeches and all this other stuff. No, they got to all that later, but the most important part of it was this text alert. And all that has morphed in different ways through Facebook videos or other kind of videos. So the technology, the speed of it, the universality of it, the way to use it as a means by which you build a party or build a political movement or reinforce a political movement. For example, in 2016 and 2015, when Donald Trump was all over the country giving rallies, there was the rally crowd, which was always large and enthusiastic. Then there was the Facebook look-in crowd. And Brad Parscale, who was then the digital director of the Trump campaign, always monitored, minute by minute, the Facebook reaction to any Trump rally. And any particular line that would generate instantaneous Facebook reaction was something he would communicate to Trump. Okay, that one really popped. Make sure you keep that in your repertoire. So they monitored and moved things around speeches based on their real-time witnessing and digesting of social media reaction to Trump's speeches that reinforced their message, that kept telling them things were working and what didn't work and why they worked. And then, for anyone who was particularly active in responding, they would make sure to double back and communicate with them via Facebook to reinforce their awareness of the rally, their commenting on it. So all of those things have advanced what campaigns know about their supporters, how campaigns touch their supporters, and how campaigns, and they've always tried to do this, but they're more successful and more technologically able to do this now, go over the heads of those reporters who are covering them, to push us to the side, to marginalize us in terms of importance. Again, that is not a new political tactic. It's as old as our democracy. But there are more technological ways in which that can happen now. That's the biggest transformation in terms of how you go about covering a campaign and the speed by which things happen in a campaign conversation, much more rapid. Campaign disagreements between candidates in 1992 would usually cover 3 or 4 days. Now they're over, if they start at 9, they're over by 11. Because they just happen so fast, because there's 17 tweets or Facebook posts or Instagram videos or whatever, and everyone has said everything within 2 hours. The surrogates, the campaign manager, the candidates, some crowd people, voters, they're all okay, what's next? So all that's gotten compressed as well. So the technology in and around the fundamentals of politics is the biggest change. There have been others, but that's the biggest by far.
Hello. Good evening. My name's Ashley Chapman. I'm a senior here. My major is digital media production and journalism with a concentration in production. I'm also the Black Student Union president here and an intern at the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. And my question really is related to that idea of change and technology. Last election was the first election where you see Gen Z entering the voting force. And now with this next election, we have a whole new onslaught of digital natives, people who were born after the internet, entering that space. And I'm interested in what you see as the implications of that, specifically around stereotypes about how we get our news, which is primarily on social media. There's an idea that we have extremely short attention spans. We're basing everything off of sound bites. We're basing everything off of article titles, but not the full article. So do you see that reflected in the way that politicians are trying to reach us? Do you see, like, kind of like you were mentioning with that Facebook, a sway towards trying to get those sound bites? And how do you think that's going to affect my generation and the way that we get news as we enter this next election?
Ashley, that's a great question. And there are a lot of dimensions to it. I won't be able to touch all the dimensions of it, but let me just give you a couple of quick observations. First of all, the idea that Americans are seduced by sound bites is not a new idea. There were books written about that in the 70s, that our culture was getting saturated in sound bites and we had short attention span theater, and the brainwaves of the average American consumer in politics were getting ever shorter, and no one really paid attention to anything, and we were easily manipulated, blah, 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 blah. It's been going on since the 70s. And yet we're still here, right? We're still functioning. So that's not a new either concern, academic worry, or snide stereotype, okay? So for your generation, there's a couple of things. Let me give you a very recent technological example that's given the Biden White House a pretty decent measure of heartburn: TikTok. There are very fundamental reasons why the Biden administration feels the need to regulate TikTok or try to find some ways to reduce the embedded influence of its Chinese creators. Yes, TikTok is an American-based company, but the algorithm and those who control the algorithm and where the algorithm goes are based in China. Well, there's this other political dynamic, which is also equally true, that many either current or potential Biden supporters watch TikTok. They are TikTok consumers. That is a very efficient way to reach them, reinforce them, motivate them, communicate with them. So you have this push me, pull you. Well, there's this thing, it's got the national security implications and the like, and yet there's a political benefit to it, but they've basically decided more on the regulatory side. But it's one of these places where this clash is very real. TikTok is a way to reach young voters. It's a very effective way, one that Republicans don't use at all. So Democrats say, hey, this is not only a venue, it's basically an unchecked venue for us. Why don't we use that even more? And that's been a dialogue that's been going on for the better part of 2.5 years. That's just one example. I also don't buy into the stereotype that younger voters are disinterested or apathetic. Statistically, they don't vote as much as people who are older. That's true. But they voted more in the last 2 elections than they did the elections before that. And I know from I have 3 children, 28, 26, and 23 years of age. They're very active, their friends are very active, and they're active at a kind of perpetual level. They don't step in and step out, and they have a snide stereotype about hashtag activism. They have a disdain for people who just hashtag something and think they've saved the world or done something to help save the world. They're very disdainful of that. And I think there is a sense of commitment for those who do follow politics to get a lot of information, follow lots of different places. I wish more kids watch CBS News, but I gave up on that a long time ago. It simply doesn't happen. I mentioned this at lunch. I mentioned my 3 children. When I went to work for CBS in 2012, all of them were either in college or about to go to college, and they knew that the ability for them to stay in college was entirely dependent on and where did work? CBS. Did any of my 3 children with this deeply embedded financial incentive watch me on television? No, they didn't. And I don't mean mostly they didn't watch. I mean they never watched me on television. They would watch me on their laptop if they saw something on our streaming news service, but as far as watching the CBS Evening News or Face the Nation or any of my no, never, not once. Not once. That's when I knew I was lost. That's when I would just stop hoping, stop dreaming, stop, oh, someday. No, it's over. But there are other means by which news can and will be consumed. And the only other last generational point I would make, and trust me, I really try to humble myself about these sort of generational assumptions, because I know not only does technology change and the fluidity of it change, and the sense of what you're getting out of it as a young person changes from month to month. What is its utility to you? What is its value to you? Something that could be a fixed value to you in August of any given year could completely disappear by December of that year. So I don't have any hard either assumptions or presumptions about news gathering or news consumption patterns of the younger generation. I just know that in my industry, we're trying as hard as we can to try to find ways to reach you, try to find ways for you to come in and take a look at what we're doing as one of many sources for you. We know it's not going to be like when all of us were young. There were 3 network news broadcasts, there was our hometown newspaper, and there were magazines, and that was it, folks. Basically 5 sources, maybe 6. That was it. You have 6 billion sources now. You've never had more sources of information, not exactly journalism, but information, available to you than you do now. So the competition for your attention span, the competition for your eyeballs has never been more intense. So we're just trying to either carve out some teeny sliver as a toehold and maybe build that out over time.
We're going to have one more round of questions from our experts here, but in the meantime, please write your questions. There's a blank sheet inside your program, so don't be bashful.
Okay. I think I'm going to ask you a question that I asked you this afternoon because I really liked it. This one is from Ashley Cummings, and she wanted to know if you ever got stage fright.
Sure. Yeah. To this day. And I do not look forward to the day when I don't. I'll need to quit. Because if I stop getting any kind of nervousness or anxiety about what I'm doing, and I don't mean paralyzing anxiety. When I first started doing television, I had a bit of that. I've often said that, so I worked at CNN starting in January of 2000. I come to CNN, to television, after an 18-year career in print. So my first job in television was covering the White House for the world's largest, most influential cable network, which CNN was in 2000. So that was a bit of an adjustment, to put it mildly. And I've often said if I had to watch any of those early live shots, I could file a petition for a human rights violation before the United Nations. They were pretty rough. And I've gotten better. As I mentioned before about muscle memory, reps matter in anything. The amount of times you do something matters. There's a whole theory about 10,000 hours. There are conversations about whether it needs to be that many or not, but repetition matters in things you care about, whether it's woodworking or broadcast journalism or painting or anything else. And you find ways to adjust to stressful situations. That's endemic to the work I do. Stressful situations are everywhere. And I've found ways to get through that, but I still always get a smidgen of that sense of anxiety. I wouldn't call it exactly stage fright. That sounds a little too dramatic, but I do have those moments when I'm nervous, and I'm very conscious of the pressure that's on me and the desire that I have to do the very best I can for the audience who's listening to me, whatever the situation. And when the day comes when I don't have any of that, I'll probably need to hang it up. So it's a good thing. It's a motivating thing. It's a clarifying thing. And it tells me that at the most instinctive part of me, which you can't override, you can control, but you can't override, it really matters deeply to me. And that's why, A, I still do it, B, I still enjoy it, and C, I'm glad it's still there.
What would you say is the biggest news story you've ever covered? And if it is the same, or what would be your favorite news story you've ever covered?
Oh, they're not the same. They're very much not the same. So this is both easy and tragic answer. I was with President Bush in Sarasota the morning of 9/11. So every moment of that morning is etched in my memory. Every moment of it. The impossibility of it. You know what I'm talking about. It seemed impossible. And the way you process that as a reporter is things can't be impossible that you're covering, because you have to make sense of it. The imperative of what you do is to make sense of this thing that you're covering. Well, what if the thing that you're covering looks and feels impossible? And you have to go on television and start explaining the impossible. That's the way that morning felt to me. One brief insight into that experience. So when the president travels, any president, there's a set of traveling reporters, and then there's you've probably heard this term, White House pool. The White House pool is a reference to 13 reporters, one from the networks, one from the 2 wire services, a photographer, a still photographer, a radio reporter. Back when there were magazines, a magazine, that's now a digital seat. But anyway, it's arrayed about all the correspondents that cover the White House, and they're rotated on a daily basis. Those 13 are with the president. So I wasn't in the pool that day. I was among the traveling White House press corps. So the pool was in the classroom with President Bush when he was reading the book, and Andy Card came in and told him about the second tower. I was not in that room. I was in the adjacent room, which is where all the other reporters were housed. And because I'm similarly aged, as most of you in this audience, we all remember when we were in school and televisions were rolled in, they were rolled in on these kind of interesting 2-level carts. I see all the nods. Thank you. God bless you for nodding to that. So we had 2 televisions in this classroom rolled in on those carts. And we were watching the live coverage of the first plane that had crashed into the first tower. And if you remember that coverage, it was all shot in the dark stuff. Like, well, maybe it was a small plane. Maybe we're not sure what it is. There sure is a lot of smoke coming out of there. It doesn't look normal. No, but everyone was sort of, what? And in this room, this adjacent classroom, there's me and about 38 or 39, so let's round it up to 40 reporters. They're not just any kind of reporters. If you're covering the White House, you're a reporter of some distinction. You just didn't arrive in Washington and say, what can I do today? You're a specified, experienced, aggressive, highly observant reporter. So there's 40 of us in this room watching live television. And the second plane flies into the second tower. And these 40 trained observers looked at one another and said, did you see that? What was that? Did you see what I just saw? My point about that was our level of disbelief overrode what we had witnessed. We're paid witnesses. That's all we do is witness and observe and document. But in that moment, the disbelief, the utter impossibility of this psychologically overrode us. And we couldn't believe, we were having this frantic conversation. Did you just, what was that? What just happened? Did a plane just fly into the second tower? Did that? And then very quickly thereafter, the sense of revulsion and panic and fear and anxiety and impossibility swept over us because we knew this was now our story for that day and for the foreseeable future. This impossible thing that in every shape and form was going to transform everything that we once understood about American impenetrability. So that is all going on. Then we have to go to work. We have to start talking to people. Senior administration officials are in that adjacent classroom. They don't know. We're asking, what are you going to do? What are you going to go? What's happening? What's the first thing the president's going to do? They don't know. So therefore, we don't know. And in a moment like that, when the people closest to the president don't know what they're going to do, you know we are in a genuinely, universally serious bit of business. Last thing I'll say about that is when the president's plane took off, Air Force One took off, we were told with absolute certainty he was going back to Washington. He wasn't in the air 30 minutes before they decided not to go back to Washington because the situation was so unpredictable, so fluid, so out of sorts. He didn't get back until late that night. He went to 2 other places, Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, Offutt Air Force Base, where Strategic Command is located in Omaha, Nebraska. Then he got back to the White House. By the way, those of us who were in Sarasota, the reporters, we didn't get back to Washington for 3 days because there were no planes, right? No planes. We flew down there on a charter, a press charter, supplied by an airline that no longer exists. These two things are unrelated, but Northwest Airlines was the airline that we rode down on a charter, on a beautiful Northwest airline. We flew down there. The FAA, late the next day, so September 12th, the next day, late, made it known quietly that it would allow that plane to fly back to Washington the next morning. All Northwest had to do was agree to fly us back. They went to the CEO and he said, the first people on a Northwest plane will not be reporters. They'll be customers. You can take that whatever way you want to take it. I didn't have time to parse that one way or the other. I just knew that we had to find some way to get back to Washington. Ultimately, all of us, the networks, the newspapers, pooled our resources, got corporate approval, and hired 3 buses for a 26-hour drive back to Andrews Air Force Base. And when we got to Andrews, our bus was stopped across the street from Andrews in a hotel parking lot, and we were met by Air Force personnel with M16s who searched our bus, searched all of us personally, and that's when I knew everything had changed. So that's the most memorable story I've ever heard.
Okay. Ashley?
Give that a moment to breathe.
Yeah.
Because my background is in digital media, I will continue to ask about it. I'm curious about how, and I'll leave this kind of open, how has kind of the advent of citizen journalism alongside social media, where everyone has kind of, I won't say equal access, but many people have access to calling themselves a journalist, to documenting, to putting themselves in someone's feed in the same space that you are. How has that affected you, and what are some of the implications of that in our democracy?
It's a great question. It's had a massive effect on news gathering. So, and I'll draw a distinction, because there are some people who regard themselves as citizen journalists who do this as kind of a low-level hobby or avocation. And then there are people who just happen to be someplace where something happens. And they take out their cell phone and they capture it. Or they're on a plane and the engine catches fire and they happen to be seated along the wing and they're like, oh my gosh, I think I'll take a video of this. And they said, would any network like this? And we say, we would love to have that. And they say, how much would you like to pay me for it? And we negotiate, because we see it first on social media, then we go after that and say, can we have it for ourselves? So that has dramatically, exponentially expanded the number of potential witnesses who are there, who are places where we're not. I mean, look, even a well-staffed television station in a place like Miami, and we have a great affiliate, CBS has a great affiliate in Miami, they're not going to be on every flight that takes off from Miami International. So if someone's on a flight and the engine catches fire, we're not going to be on that flight, but they are. And if they sell us the video, we have news for tonight's evening news of a jet engine that's on fire and a plane landed safely. And we hear from the people because that person told us who was sitting next to them, and all of a sudden we have a little story, which we would have never had in that way before. That's one transformative aspect. There is another deeply revolutionary aspect to this, and it goes back to observations I made about being a police reporter in Amarillo, Texas, or Las Vegas, or Houston. So when I was a police reporter, Amarillo, 84 to 86, Las Vegas, 86 to 88, Houston, 88 to 90, if there was an officer-involved shooting, there was one version of events. One version. It wasn't the witness's version. It was the police version. The police wrote the report. The police explained what happened. The police told the story. I'm not suggesting the police lied. I'm just saying the police told their side of the story. When cell phone cameras became, if not ubiquitous, much more available, there was another vantage point. And that other vantage point revolutionized our concept of what happens in these circumstances and gave us another way to evaluate, A, what happened, and B, the rendered story told by the police. Sometimes those are in conflict, sometimes they aren't. But, again, as with any local set of reporters, TV or print, they're not going to be, unless it's a complete coincidence, an accident, at the site of an officer-involved shooting. But someone who is a witness is and has some vantage point on that. Police departments don't have body cams because they thought it was a great idea. Police departments have body cams to have another set of video to have as evidence to protect the police department when they know there are going to be other people who have video. There would not be police cameras on officers were it not for the first arrival and then civilly judiciable point of view of other witnesses with other evidence. Evidence, not conjecture, not memory, evidence. Things they saw, things they've recorded. That has revolutionized and, we must admit, made more difficult for our country this conversation about what this is and what these are and what are the contours and what are the behavioral aspects of officer-involved shootings. And what is justice in these encounters? Is the use of deadly force the only or the best response? Well, we have a very lively, to put it mildly, debate in our country about that because of this witnessing. Is some of it from a particular point of view, and do some people regard that as distorted? Do police departments view it as distorted? Certainly they do, but they know they can't stop it. That's why they have their own body cams. So in that space, that digital witnessing has completely, in ways that were inconceivable before the arrival of digital cameras in the hands of witnesses, changed this particular aspect of American policing, American justice, and the interaction of communities therein. One of the largest, most transformative components, often overlooked in the modern American journalistic landscape.
Thank you, all three of you. The questions were just terrific. Now we turn to the audience. Thank you. We have a handful of questions, and we'll try to get through most of them. Thank you. Can you talk a little about the Electoral College, where it's fit in the past, and are there moves afoot to alter that?
Sure, there are moves to get rid of it.
That might work.
I'm not here to argue on behalf of the Electoral College or persuade you one way or the other. People are concerned about the Electoral College because of recent inversions, and inversion is a classic example of more popular vote than electoral allocation of votes. That feels anti-democratic to many people in this country. I mentioned Grover Cleveland quite a while ago. Grover Cleveland was a victim of this. Grover Cleveland won the popular vote in all 3 elections that he was in. He lost to William Henry Henderson in the 1888 election because of the Electoral College inversion. So it's not a entirely modern affliction. It can happen. It's a mathematical possibility. The Electoral College was established to mediate across distances and to avoid the tendency of politicians to overemphasize urban centers, of which there were just a few in the early part of our country, over the less populated areas. And yes, Southerners predominantly were interested in this. There are those who believe the Electoral College is a part of that slavocracy, racist history of our country. I would say the Electoral College stands distinct from that, and it had other reasons for existing, and it remains because it mediates against a tendency to chase the maximum number of voters where they are. And if we got rid of the Electoral College, campaigns would be in every major city and nowhere else. Just figure it out. They'd be in the major cities and the suburbs and no place else. They just wouldn't. Candidates aren't fools. Candidates go where the most of the votes are. Candidates go to the most direct line between aspiration and victory. Nothing else. Aspiration and victory, that's it. What's the shortest line between those two things? You get rid of the Electoral College, that means Chicago, New York, Houston, Miami, big population centers they're distributed across the country for sure. And the suburbs around there, they get all the rallies, they get all the attention, they get all the leafleting, they get all the voter contact. The rest of the country just sort of drifts away. And the one thing that people say, well, it's not dynamic. Well, look, Georgia was not on the map 2 elections ago. It's on the map now. Arizona wasn't on the map 2 elections ago. It's on the map now. Wisconsin wasn't on the map in 2016. Boy, sure hell won in 2020. Things change, all right? We are a dynamic country, so the idea that the Electoral College is stacked and situated and never moves, that's not true. Because populations move. Our country moves around. Our country moves around so much more than other countries. It's one of the strengths of our country, and it's impressive that we maintain all of this constitutional and political order by changing all the time. We're moving constantly. Most other countries don't do that. Most countries are much more sedentary than ours. We move around a lot. We change points of view, and yet we still maintain this sense of political order. Electoral College doesn't enhance or diminish that, but because we move around, states pop up that are unexpected. North Carolina can't quite decide what it wants to be, in or out. Virginia can't quite decide, in or out. California used to be reliably Republican. There's a great Chevy Chase movie in which was done in like the late 70s, and there's a line about California that always sticks in my mind. He's talking about the politics of California, and he's reminded, we know California is a very conservative state. I'm like, what? I mean, that's like out of the Ice Age, man. So these things move around. Again, I'm not an advocate. I'm not a pest. I don't give speeches for the Electoral College. I don't give speeches to denounce it. I just describe it as it's historically rooted and how it plays out practically.
Abortion was an important issue in the 2022 election.
Sure.
How big of an issue do you think it'll be in 2024? And what do you think another 2 or 3 major issues will be as we head into next November?
Certainly, abortion will be an enormously important issue. Access to and availability thereof, and what other things related to this sense of privacy and privacy rights might be jeopardized or threatened in the future. I'll tell you something that was true about America and abortion politics based on my experience until the Dobbs decision was handed down. Until the Dobbs decision was handed down, traveling all around this country, through all the campaigns I covered, both presidential, House races, Senate races, governor's races, until the Dobbs decision, I never met in our country a single issue pro-choice voter. What I mean by that is that was their one issue, and that was the determining factor for them, a single issue pro-choice voter. I met hundreds of single issue pro-life voters. Hundreds upon hundreds until Dobbs. I have since met many single issue pro-choice voters. That is the apex from which every other thing flows, just like it was for pro-life voters. So that is a fundamental shift. That is something, that's where I start. My political conversation starts here and flows from that. So that's a shift. And it's been reflected in election outcomes in Kansas, Montana, Wisconsin, Ohio. Ohio's been trending all one direction. Yeah. Then they have the constitutional amendment vote. Wow. Right. Look, the reason I consider election day like one of the greatest days of the calendar year is because I get to hear what actually matters. Not from the politicians, not from the speechwriters, not from the lobbyists, not from the think tanks, from the people who decide what this country's future is all about. That's why I love elections. That's why I love Election Day. You can't look at all that data. You can't look at Kansas, Montana, Wisconsin, Ohio. Say, well, there's nothing to see here. There is something to see here. Something has shifted. People are saying this matters to me, matters more than it used to matter. Because before I assumed, now I know I can't assume. So it starts here. Been a big issue. The other issues, look, really trenchant insight is coming your way. Brace yourself, get ready. The economy is going to be really important. Hello, yes. There's this question of will there be a recession? Will there be a soft landing? Trust me, recessions are statistical, soft landings are metaphorical. The economy is what you say it is. Yeah. The economy is what you say it is. I can give you every statistic on planet Earth, and if you're not happy, the economy sucks. Conversely, I can give you bad statistics, but if you've had a really great year, you're like, well, I don't know. I'm kind of all right. It's a very, very personal thing. Economics is deeply personal. So obviously that will be huge. I think those are going to be the two biggest. And then this grander sense of what is the course and what is the direction? Not of our democracy, because when I say that, a third of the audience I say that to tunes out. Yeah. Because they want to tell me, thinking I don't know, assuming I don't know, and I do know, they say, well, you don't understand. We don't live in a democracy, Major. We live in a constitutional republic. I know where we live. I know what we are. We are a constitutional republic. A constitutional republic that functions when representatives are gathered from across the country to debate issues, reflecting their constituents, but doing so in a collaborative national forum like the House of Representatives. And so into that constitutional republic, one of the things that needs to function, back to where I started, is a House of Representatives. So I know what we are. And that question about how is this American experiment going, and are we moving in directions that are inconsistent with the preservation and the maintenance of the constitutional republic and the democratic practices, small d, within which we sustain it. That will be the other of the big three.
Are you surprised by the enduring popular enthusiasm for Donald Trump?
Am I surprised by it?
And how do you explain it?
Well, how do I explain it? Whoa.
Oh, I forgot the second part.
Surprise is a tricky word because it carries with it a kind of judgment that I think should not be part of how I absorb it. I should be neither surprised nor unsurprised by political movements in this country. I should be rooted in the observation that they exist and how they exist and why they exist. And to try to get at the why, I can only rely on all the conversations I've had with Trump supporters. I've been to more than 100 Trump rallies, most of them in the 2015-2016 campaign, at least 75 then, about 25 since then when he was president. I haven't been to any in this campaign season yet, but I read through all the reporting our other reporters do when they interact with voters, and it's very similar. There's a long-running anti-establishment part of Trump that is deeply embedded in the American psyche. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, talking about the comparisons between the digital age in which we're living and the Gilded Age of the past, the sense of dislocation is profound, and the sense of anxiety and psychological unmooring is very real. And Trump offers people a sense that he knows the way, or he has a sense of the way, and will fight for your way through this. That's a deeply powerful, connected way to think about politics. There's also something about Trump that makes people, and I wrote about this in my book, my fourth book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride. He makes people who listen to him, especially at rallies, but even generically, feel smarter. It's one of my best jokes, I swear to God. And I mean that in all earnestness. It may sound like a psychotic thing, but it makes them feel smart. What do I mean by that? People go to a Trump rally, and if they're with their spouse or their partner, haven't I been saying that for 20 years? Haven't I been telling you that for 20 years? My man's up there and he's saying it right now. He's going to be president of the United States. Haven't I been? They suddenly feel like they've been onto something. Like they're smarter. Like they're the ones who figured this out. Now, I'm not saying they are smarter. I'm not saying Trump is smarter. That's not the point. The point is that sense of connection, that sense of, hey, I'm now not just notionally or kind of seasonally invested, I'm invested. One thing you can say about this movement or this attachment is that it is not seasonal. It is deep. And there is also a sense, and this is part of our politics now, of separateness. We feel in our country that political disagreements are not disagreements. They're clashes of understandings, they're clashes of values, they're clashes of culture. And the media has, to a small degree, contributed to this with all the blue-red state terminology. And we have more states in our country now than ever before that are trifecta states. What's a trifecta state? A trifecta state is a state where the governor and the House and the Senate are all of one party. So blue states get bluer, red states get redder, and the differences between those states become more apparent. And we feel more alienated from places that adopt laws that reflect their politics than we used to. That sense of separateness now feels something much closer to primal. And that's part of our politics now as well. And no one operates rhetorically in that space more aggressively than Trump. We are this, they are that, we are better, and they are much worse. And that sense of not only do we disagree, but we are threatened by them, and they pose a genuine threat to us is a part of that rhetoric and a part of that followership. It's clear. And our politics has found ways in which to invest a lot of emotional energy in that sense of deep differences that are beyond policy disagreements about what's the proper reimbursement rate for a Medicare procedure, or what drugs should or should not be negotiated for on Medicare, or what's the tax rate for corporations or individuals. Much more beyond that, much bigger sense of I'm for this, they're for that. The big labels, the big pictures, those apply. I'm in my camp, they're in that camp, and we really don't relate to one another the way we used to. And I'll give you one statistical way to think about this. In the early 70s to mid 70s of our country, if you looked at Gallup polling data, even though it was no longer a crime because the Supreme Court had made a decision about this in a very famous case, Loving versus Virginia, there was still embedded resistance across our country to interracial marriage and interracial dating. That's all vanished as a matter of polling. It's insignificant now. You know what's replaced it? Political parties. There is now equal reservation and hesitation within families to having a son or daughter not date across racial lines, but date across political lines. Think about that. We have substituted one set of anxieties for another. We solved one enormous problem. Not solved, that's too strong a word. We have addressed and moved in a direction of harmonizing one very deep, historically embedded problem. Ashley laughed at me. I apologize for saying solved. And we replaced it with another that we never had before. That's a reflection of this sense of not just differences, but deep differences. And that is one of the things that fuels that political approach.
Talk about the impact of two individuals on the election, Kamala Harris and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Well, the vice president will lean very heavily into the two of the issues I described, abortion/privacy rights and democratic experiment voting rights, things like that. She's actually been used more aggressively by the Biden White House in the last 6 months than she was in the first part of her vice presidency. Of course, if Biden's the nominee, then she's the running mate, and that remains status quo. But as I said at the very top, I don't know if that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, that creates all sorts of tectonic shifts within the Democratic Party. And all bets are off. And she knows it, and everyone in the Democratic Party knows it. If Biden isn't the nominee, somehow bows out, she will not be the heir apparent. She will not be the assumed nominee of the party. How the party is going to explain that to the country, I'll leave that to them. But that's what's going to happen. And she knows it, everyone around her knows it, and all the ambitious Democrats who someday want to be president know that. So there's all this sort of swirling shark-like under the surface of the water maneuvering just in case the president, for whatever reason, doesn't seek renomination. If he does, they're the ticket. And the polling data is the polling data. She's not popular. She's not considered a suitable replacement for Biden. Country's uncomfortable by her, does not feel she's distinguished herself in the vice presidency. A lot of that could be related to either a race-based antagonism or a sex-based antagonism. She is a historical figure as the first African-American vice president. Her people believe that that's one of the problems. They would like more Democratic support to recontextualize that, but those ambitious Democrats do not want to lean in to help her. That's kind of one of the subtextual storylines in Washington. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., so he's on Fox more than he's on MSNBC. He's never on MSNBC. Where do Democrats typically get their news? From MSNBC. Do they mostly get it from Fox? No, they don't. Who gets it from Fox? Republicans. So Fox has identified Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as a potential drag on Biden, but he may not. If he runs as a third party, where is he going to get more of his votes? I don't know, but I think it's possible that he gets more votes from the Republican side of the aisle than the Democratic side of the aisle. That's an unknown. He has a following. Having a following is not enough to become president. It's not enough to become a pain to a sitting president. You have to have a larger following, and he has to dramatically increase what he has to something larger. He has so far, despite a lot of attention and sort of springboarding in the spring, meaning he was getting a lot of publicity and got a time to spend before Congress, nothing much has happened since then. He's sort of still right where he was 3 or 4 months ago. That does not strike me as a campaign building momentum. It strikes me as a campaign that is just treading water. But as a third party, next year, with all these other variables, it's another X factor.
Well, you've been the Y factor for us tonight, Major. This is the 44th year of the forum. We've had 184 speakers. We've had a lot of Pulitzer Prize winners, Emmy winners. We've had football coaches and the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Tonight we had a gem.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
We're great.
And round of applause for the students and their questions, please.
You're not done yet.
Oh gosh! Here, I thought I could go watch playoff baseball.
We're grateful for the information that you shared, but mostly we're grateful because you've made us think. So I appreciate that. Now we have a little gesture of thanks,
Oh, all right.
and thank you for not knocking it over.
I tried very much to be aware of that. I tried very much to be aware of that. Oh, look at that.
Wonderful picture of the campus.
That's pretty cool. Very nice. Wow. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for coming. October 14th, Tuesday night, John Fritz from USA Today, who covers the Supreme Court, and he'll have a discussion of how supreme is the Supreme Court. So, November. Thank you. November 14th, the Tuesday night. Thank you very much, President.
Thanks, everybody.
Abear.
Thanks, everybody.